We are now recording. I'm going to hit the transcript. Transcript is live. Enable. And I'm going to duck out.
Yes, you are.
We are live.
All right,
Folks should start populating the room right now.
Great, thank you. So just wait a minute for everybody to join here. Right, and I think we'll get started. Hello and welcome to Climate Conversations, a space for exploring what climate literacy looks like in the 21st century. Climate Conversations are chats with some of the leading voices at the intersection of children's literature and climate activism. The goal is to share actionable insights and invite you to consider how to apply them to the questions and challenges of climate change, both in your own life and in helping your children or students navigate their own. These conversations are a feature of Climate Lit, climatelit.org, which is a free online resource for building universal climate literacy with children's and young adult literature and media. We will be recording this conversation and it will be posted on the Climate Lit website. Today, I am very happy to be highlighting the work of educators around the world who are engaging students of all ages as climate literate global citizens. Their work is featured in the recently published collection, Literature as a Lens for Climate Change, using narratives to prepare the next generation, which is available through Rowman and Littlefield. A pause here, if you can hear my dog, I apologize. That is Owen, and he likes to make appearances sometimes in my Zoom presentation. He's my little office co-worker. So our collection, each chapter in this collection explores the ways that stories and storytelling can serve as a lens for helping students understand climate change and for fostering empathy toward people and places disproportionately impacted by it. And I will send a link in the chat here to the book. I believe it was also in our event page. So I'm Rebecca Young, the editor of this collection, and I serve as a language, literature, and civics content manager for the nonprofit education improvement organization Cognia. I also serve as an associate editor for the Climate Lit Initiative. I am zooming in from Oneonta, New York, known as the Iroquois as the place of the open rocks. I am joined today by several contributors to the book, which is wonderful because we've been working together for so long only over email. It's really good to see their faces and to have them meet each other. On a personal note, one of the things I've most appreciated in our work together over the past year is the exchanges that we've shared about what's going on in each other's parts of the world. This has truly been an international collaboration, and we've lamented unnatural weather conditions, civil and political unrest in our areas of the world, and the failure of governments to enact strong climate policies or any climate policies. Still, the underlying thread of our communication has been hopeful because we all believe in the work we are doing. We are diving into plans for our students, organizing conference talks, recruiting any of our colleagues who will listen to join this climate education mission. So I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that our hearts and our minds are elsewhere today with the people of Ukraine. While it has been devastating to see this disaster unfold, the Ukrainian strength and determination to fight has been incredible. And I know that our thoughts and our hopes are with them, as I'm sure they are with all of you, and with all who are supporting their efforts or providing safe haven. Again, thank you all for joining us today from whatever part of the world you are zooming in from. We are very happy to have you. So our goal for the collection we are sharing with you today is to advocate, quite simply, for comprehensive climate education through the lens of literature by offering a rationale and strategies for doing so that are adaptable to different grade and ability levels, from very early education to post-secondary school. The introduction to the book explores why literature is an effective lens for understanding the causes, consequences, and potential solutions of climate change and its impacts. The research-based crux of this is that our engagement with good stories and the perspective-taking role we assume when we read can foster understanding and empathy about real-world concerns. This, of course, has long been a part of the indigenous wisdom and oral storytelling of many cultures. And as it relates to climate literacy and climate justice today, empathy connected with awareness, especially with support from a mentor, may lead to action that helps combat the eco-grief and anxiety our students feel about the future. We are very thankful to have two prominent researchers frame our collection with a foreword by Alexa Wakebaum-Mosner, author of Effective Ecologies, Empathy, Emotion, and Environmental Narratives, and an afterword by Suzanne Keene, author of Empathy and the Novel. Much of their research informs this approach and many of the strategies discussed in our collection. To share a bit of what this resource offers, I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and share some ideas about their approach to teaching young people about climate change. We would then love to open it up to your questions and comments. A few of our contributors could not join us. We are operating from many different time zones across the world, so I will just give a brief summary of their work as we go through. So the first chapter offers an informative rationale for educating toward climate literacy at any age by Climate Lit co-founder and University of Minnesota Twin Cities professor of children and adult literature, Marek Oziabich. He offers guidance for educators to develop eco-pedagogy around any number of classroom texts and addresses the context necessary for understanding climate change and its potential solutions. This is a great resource for any teacher trying to get started because it gives a lot of the frameworks in terms of the language and the context that students need to sort of start approaching these difficult topics. Chapter 2 is authored by Suhasini Vincent, who is an associate professor at the University Panthéon-Assas in Paris, and explains how literature can inform students' understanding of the interrelated causes and consequences of climate change, particularly in developing parts of the world. Suhasini analyzes the literature of Arundhati Roy and Amitav Ghosh through the lens of post-colonial eco-criticism and provides guidance on how to engage upper-level students in this effort. This is a deep dive of eco-critical analysis. Our chapter 3 author is here. So Anna, I will turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at. My name is Anna Bernstein. I teach 8th grade English in Nashville, Tennessee. My co-author for this chapter is Kayla Sweeney. She can't be here with us right now. She teaches high school now in Athens, Georgia. And our chapter centers around using YA dystopian cli-fi or climate fiction in order to allow students to process both the trauma of climate change and climate catastrophe, as well as encourage them to reimagine a future in which they are actors in diminishing the impact of climate change. So when we did this project, we work at an international baccalaureate middle years program school. One of the aspects of that program is by the end of their 3rd year, they do a community-based project. Within this project, they identify a need within their community, they research that need, and then they come up with some sort of action-based plan, not to solve that issue, but to in some way impact that issue. When we had done this project in the past, we noticed that one of the big anxiety creators for students in middle school was climate change. One of the things that kind of came up over and over again for them when they were brainstorming issues that they saw impacting their world, there was an underlying current of anxiety around climate change and around the environmental impact that the climate crisis may have on their future. And so we decided that before we launched this kind of summative project at the end of the year, we wanted to delve a little bit more deeply into the climate crisis from a hopeful standpoint and also a research-based standpoint. This started basically with us doing traditional literature circles. So we identified 3 at the time, like pretty current and new YA dystopian texts. So that would be Dry by Neil Shusterman, which is a book about California water crisis that feels like really urgent for students because it's a very like modern take on what happens the next day after a community runs out of water, based on the improper management of resources. We also read The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Demeline, which is a story about a future world in which we've been devastated by global warming, and the only people who are really thriving in this future world are the indigenous populations of North America. Particularly, that book has a Canadian view on things. And then also a book called Not a Drop to Drink, which is the story of a young girl who's kind of protecting the water resources that she has from a pretty overbearing government. So through the analysis and reading of these books with our students in this shared experience, our goal was twofold. One, to allow students to process the severity and the anxiety of climate change through imagined text. So nonfiction about climate change is obviously very overwhelming, particularly to 12 and 13-year-old students. And so using the YA dystopian fiction allowed them a little bit of space to process the issues that they know are real, but also feel a little bit safer because it was still a fictional text. And then we also wanted to use these books as an entry point to talk about larger issues like race and privilege. We paired each text with nonfiction articles that kind of highlighted particular issues within each text. So for Dry, we read nonfiction articles that talk about how privilege, economic privilege, and racial privilege and neighborhood privilege play a part in who is most drastically affected by water shortages. For The Marrow Thieves, we paired texts that talk about how indigenous populations are disproportionately affected by the obviously negative impact of climate change. And then for Not a Drop to Drink, we focused on governmental control and solutions and the hoarding of natural resources. So for each of these texts, we wanted to allow students not only to process the trauma of the climate crisis, but also reimagine futures in which they are active agents of change. By the end of this whole unit, students wrote their own dystopian cli-fi, which was also kind of a therapeutic way to process all of the information they had learned. And then they were also asked to apply the things that they had learned about change making and root cause analysis to their community-based projects. So they didn't have to end up actually like researching or acting on climate change, but they could use the ways that authors process climate change and the climate crisis in order to influence the way they're thinking about larger systemic issues. I feel like that was too much. So I'm gonna end my part on there. But thank you for listening to something that we had a really good time with and think is really important for students to hear about. So.
Thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. And I know we'll have more opportunities to talk about it and ask you some questions later on here. So Ryan, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan. I'm speaking here from Vancouver Island in Canada. So good morning to all of you. My chapter, I guess I'll summarize it very quickly. I guess I always start with this, which is if I ask my students if there are any big issues that they're worried about, they'll almost always say climate change is an issue that matters a lot. And yet in my experience, they don't have a lot of knowledge actually about climate change or anything else, frankly. They just have a sort of statement like climate change is important. And sometimes I see in them not complacency, but instead a sort of resignation. It's a big deal. What can I do? So this unit kind of, I find I often am starting with that. I kind of think then that what I really want to do is provoke curiosity in my students, try to get them just to think as much as possible. So we start with this question, which is what is natural, what is unnatural? And I just invite the students to sort of think about it. One of the things that they almost always say is that people are unnatural and anything that people do is unnatural. In some sort of fundamental way, the students have intuited that people are not a part of the planet somehow. that they are separate from it. And I think there's good reason for that. We often do have a sort of human exceptionalism in our understanding of how to use resources or how to determine what has value, for example. So people have value, things that people value have value, but nothing else sort of does. So the students have sort of intuited that. And as a consequence, it seems like they're not really sure where to proceed or how to go forward. So in this unit, I just invite them to almost like approach this question like a wedge and then see what they can dig up after that. A lot of this unit consists of students doing research into topics of their choosing. So there's a whole bunch of things that they try to do. So I've got, actually I'm teaching this unit right now. I've got one student doing a potential for military conflict in the Arctic, given that our current projections are that we'll see potentially no ice in summers within the next 10 to 20 years. That seems bad. I have a student who's doing transhumanism right now and looking at these ideas of, can we have people living forever? Obviously, we see common topics like water shortages. And I have a student right now who's considering questions like degrowth versus a sort of abundance agenda powered by other energies other than fossil fuels, right? And in this assignment, what I'm really trying to do is a sort of two-part thing, I suppose, which is one, I want to see them demonstrate some pretty concrete understanding of science or projections or data, stuff like that. So there's a sort of background overview. And in the second part, I suppose, I would say there's a sort of policy question or policy evaluation. What should we do? What would be admirable? What would be realistic, right? And these are the sorts of questions I really want students to do. When I put this structure together, I suppose if I was to underline anything, I would say that I'm trying to get my students to really address scientific understanding as much as possible, while also addressing policy or humanity sort of questions. So it seems to me that there's a sort of common, if you're an expert in science, you might say, well, we should just do this. If you're an expert in policy, you'll say, well, we should just do this. There's a sort of difficulty of these two fields talking to each other. And I feel like English has been, at least in my experience, a good place to actually bring them all in, just under a sort of broad umbrella of literacy. We do other things. I lead some lessons, such as like we consider cities, romanticism, sort of nostalgia for the past, and other lessons as well. Can we really wall ourselves off from the environment if it's sort of, all of our pollution is entering our bodies through microplastics and air pollutions and air particulates? Really trying to, again, examine that question that I think in English has often been person versus nature, right? That's what we've often had as a sort of conflict in literature. And I'm trying to kind of push against that or else push through it to see what's on the other side of it. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Ryan. And I will hand it off now to David.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and good afternoon. I'm speaking from South Africa. I'm in Johannesburg, and it is about 5:20 in the afternoon. That is why I said good afternoon to you. I realize that it is a different time for some of the other panelists. A bit about myself. I am the head of Department of Education and Curriculum Studies at the University of Johannesburg in the Faculty of Education. And I work with undergrad and postgrad students. My focus on eco-criticism is mostly with the undergrad students, but I do have some postgrad work with them. So that is a little bit about my background. I have over 30 years experience in education, of which about 16 years was in secondary school education, where I was an English teacher. And then I became an academic. And what is interesting for me about my own journey has been that when I studied initially and did my undergrad work, there were no courses at all about literature and the environment. This is something which I have grown into as an individual, and I find it very fulfilling. The other matter that I think I need to briefly address is that I address issues of climate change, but I also address broader matters relating to the environment. And as a consequence, I think I have a sort of integrated module that I present to my students in undergrad. And I also base some of what I do on the lived experiences of the students. For those of you who read my chapter, you will see that it starts with a reference to Cape Town in 2017. When I went to Cape Town to a conference in 2017, there were signs in the airport saying things like, "We have a water crisis, don't waste water." And so it was a very strongly foregrounded lived experience for the people of that city. And the limit that was imposed was 55 liters of water per person per day. When I got a taxi from the airport, the man in the taxi, the taxi driver said to me, "We don't wash our cars anymore." And I said, "Okay, I'm fine with that. I'm inside the car." But it was interesting to be in what is essentially a crisis-driven situation. And I will add that since I completed my chapter, there have been areas in South Africa where there are cities with limited water, or where there are elements of breakdown in the system. We're talking about quite a significant matter about water crisis across the country, not just in one area. But the Cape Townian experience has been resolved, and through human initiative, Cape Town has been able to address this challenge. And I guess that's a positive, because through human initiative, we in South Africa are able to resolve the challenges we encounter. I think that it is important to identify some of the theories that I address in my classes. I use the work of various theorists, but Greg Gerard is one that I use regularly. And in his theoretical positioning, there are different attitudes towards the environment. And one of them he calls cornucopianism, in which the environment is simply seen as a resource for humans to use. And there's no sort of responsibility. It's simply something that is available to use. And then there are other theoretical positionings, such as environmentalism, in which people express concerns for the environment, but they normally expect the government to address that kind of topic. And then there's deep ecology. And deep ecology is a more radical type of theory, where human beings are not regarded as the center of all that is important. And that is quite a challenging ecological position for many people who are simply just trying to make their way through life, and to suddenly realize that their desires might not be central to the well-being of all. And then, of course, I also address the issue of ecofeminism, because I think that is an important matter. It is something that needs to be addressed, because we have many elements of society that are overtly patriarchal. And I think we need to acknowledge that ecofeminism has a strong contribution to make. Now, in terms of the literature, what we do is we approach various texts and we consider them in terms of the theories, and the students write either assignments or examinations, or both, in which they consider how they would teach particular texts. And in my chapter, I've used extracts of those student responses for a discussion about the value of eco-criticism and the issue of climate change. So that is essentially what I address in my module. It's interesting to see that students sometimes use books like stuff from Dr. Seuss, because, you know, this is university level and you think, what, Dr. Seuss? But there is something interesting there and it's a lot of fun. So students get into this and they do enjoy it. And I am strongly committed to this particular theoretical positioning, and I've published in this field before. I want to just add that there are a couple of further matters. These also developed after I finished my chapter. One is that the climate change issue is somewhat compromised because in South Africa, we have coal-fired power stations for the vast majority of our electricity supply. And there are arguments against this, but of course there are also other arguments such as people would lose their jobs if we close the coal mines. And so there is a debate going on about that. And then there are also people doing research off the coast of South Africa. And there are significant protests and legal challenges to the search for oil and other sorts of natural resources because of the possible marine impact. So there are many debates going on in South Africa about these sorts of things, and they are all rich sources for discussion. And the most important thing for me is that the educational impulse is the important one, because if we engage in debate and discussion about these matters, we can possibly find better ways forward. I want to make one last comment, and that is I want to thank Rebecca for her patience with me. I think I was a bit challenging at times with my writing, and thank you for directing me, regarding this particular chapter. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, David. I love your chapter, and I think in particular the opening that you share about the water crisis, the lived experience as you present it in South Africa, was very sobering indeed for me. So I enjoyed working with you on your chapter very much, and I know that readers will appreciate that perspective in terms of the water crisis. Now, for many of us reading about it, hearing about it, it's there. And you really bring it to the front of that lived experience happening right now. So thank you. And I'll just put a note here, a pause. I noticed we do have a question or two coming in. As you have questions for the panelists, we will get to those after everyone's had a chance to introduce their chapters. So if you want to go ahead and start putting those in the Q&A rather than the chat, we will get to those, because I know some of you are wondering about age groups and experiences like that. So Tim, I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much. And thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing your work. I'm Tim Duggan. I am a professor of secondary education at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. And I prepare or help to prepare people to teach in an urban environment. And one of those people, one of my graduate students, Natalie Valentine Espiet, is my co-author, and she cannot be with us because she's student teaching right now. Where I am, it is 9:29 in the morning. So it's kind of nice, it's kind of neat that we have people from all over. I've been concerned with this work for a long time. I started my teaching career in 1984, and not symbolically, but really. This particular idea that I explore in my chapter is to take a passage from Shakespeare, particularly from a play that gets worked in schools quite a bit, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a popular play, and I started kind of forming this idea actually about 30 years ago, but then I had the opportunity to work with some students in Omaha, Nebraska, actually about 15 years ago. And we started playing with a long monologue by Titania, Queen of the Fairies, as she's arguing with her husband, Oberon, King of the Fairies. And she catalogs this whole list of climate disasters that she attributes to the quarrel between herself and her husband. And recently I had and this book has given me the opportunity to return to that. A couple of years ago, I was doing a workshop at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater with some teachers, and we took a look at this piece and divided it up to embody the different sections of the speech. What she does is she lays out the argument, saying that, you know, Oberon has accused her of infidelity, so to speak, with Theseus, the mortal who's the Duke of Athens, and she has accused him of having a romantic thing going with Hippolyta, who's also a mortal, a queen of the Amazons. And so Titania accuses him, saying, you know, every time we get together, never met we on hill and dale, forest or mead, et cetera, to dance our ringlets to the whistling wind, but with thy brawls thou hast disturbed our sport. And at that point she pivots and says, therefore, the winds piping to us in vain, as in revenge have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs, which falling in the land have every pelting river made so proud that they have overborne their continents. And she goes on and lists this whole catalog of problems. But at the end of her speech, she says that this same progeny of evils comes from our debate, from our dissension. We are their parents and originals. So in other words, blaming this upset in nature and all these horrible things on the dissension between the two of them. So one of the things that my chapter examines, or our chapter, I should say, Natalie and my chapter examines, is this intersection between human relationships and climate change, and the idea of discord versus harmony. And granted, while these characters in the Shakespeare play are mythical characters or fairies, they are anthropomorphized, and they have human characteristics, and they think and they speak like humans. And I think that's important. And I think, you know, honestly, this is part of what we're seeing right now as our hearts break over what's going on in Ukraine, is this idea of how discord among our species, as you know, Ryan was talking about, we're having that sense of you know, that we control everything, what the expenses are of that, what the costs are of that. And here we've got a relationship between two spouses, and you know, almost at the most intimate level, that in a sense engenders all this discord, which leads to all kinds of problems. So what we do in the workshop is we split students into groups, and since climate change is such a broad thing, you know, as Anna was mentioning, it's almost overwhelming for students to think about. But each of these 12 chunks of this speech provides one kind of problem, and you can put small groups of kids together and ask them to look at those two lines that they have and somehow embody it in a performed ensemble piece of this speech. And then the second part is to then ask them to find some informational text on that particular climate problem to connect it to today. And then so students might have one problem of flooding, and then they look up what's going on with flooding, or toxic pollution, toxic air pollution. And then they research that, and either the teacher can provide them with a short text from a reliable source to give them that information, or they can seek it out themselves. And then they incorporate that into their performance. whether through echoes of it with the Shakespeare text or by examining that as well. So we've got like separate and synergistic lines of inquiry that the students are taking on, and then as a group the whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there will probably be some time for questions.
Great, thanks very much, Tim. Love that sort of repurposing of a very classic text and letting teachers use something they're already working with in the classroom for maybe an entryway for them and for their students into climate conversations. And Karna, you are up. Over to you.
Hi. Yeah.
We can hear
I
you.
don't
Yes.
know. Can you see me? Yeah.
We can. Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon here. Good morning there. And I don't know around the world. And so I'm Encarna or María Encarnación Carrillo. First of all, I apologize on behalf of my colleague Lorraine Kuslake, who is unable to attend due to her classes this afternoon. And besides, we would like to thank the editors of this book for giving us the opportunity to present our innovation and research project developed in 2 universities here in Spain, the University of Murcia and the University of Alicante, in 2 subjects that are English as a foreign language, right? So we present a chapter number 7 in this book entitled Raising Environmental Awareness and Language Acquisition Through Haiku. Yeah. And here this chapter is divided in several subtitles. And we have towards a humanistic approach to language teaching, global education and the role of literature. Why haiku? Why we choose haiku in order to work in the English classroom as a foreign language. And then haiku, the value and the positive, we develop those positive aspects that haikus have in order to being used as an educative resource for our classes, in order to teach English and in order to foster or to teach in an indirect way environmental values. So and then we describe in this title, in this chapter, the whole project, where we read several poems in English. That poems were easy because the level of our students is here at the university. The level of these students is basic level in order for you to understand. And we had to use easy poems. The poems that we read during the whole course were Windy Nights by Stevenson, Colors by Rossetti, The Month of the Year by Sarah Coleridge, and You Are All, Father William by Lewis Carroll, and Morning Has Broken by Eleanor Fajon. So, and after the reading of these poems, we developed several activities. These activities can be considered creative activities, as and we developed a kind of poetry workshop in our class, and we did a poetic college that was a poem created by using the verses of different poems. We developed another activity called Blackout Poetry, creating poems by crossing out the words of one of the poems we had been read. Another activity was a collaborative poem, a poem created in collaboration by a group of students, where each student writes a verse. Then we developed a calligram, that is, we create a calligram with one of the poems. They chose one poem and then develop this kind of figure or picture with the poem. And we write poetry using different apps for writing civil poetry that you can find on the internet for free. And then we developed another activity using Twitter, and they created poems using tweets from famous people. So there were the different kinds of activities we did in this poetry workshop. And after that, we focused on haikus. The end of the project were haikus, and was developed during the lockdown. And the students were at home, as we were at home here too. They had to develop an activity called From My Window. They have to write poems about all that kind of nature that they could see from the windows, and they should make a photo from the windows. And that was the poems, the collection of poems that they created in order to perform the activity. And after that, we discover the great value of haikus in order to teach these environmental values. Apart from teaching English, using poetry for teaching English was a great opportunity for us to teach English from another perspective, to teach a foreign language in a creative way. Besides, we foster all these kinds of environmental message that was involved with haikus, right? And that's all. If you have any question.
Great, thank you, Encarna. And I'll just put it out there that I found your chapter very unique, because when I first started with this project, the last thing I expected was how to teach about climate change in the language classroom and learning English as a foreign language. So I think it's a really unique perspective. And like many of the chapters in our collection, yours is very versatile in terms of what age group it can be used with, because while you were working largely with pre-service educators, some of the materials could be used with very young students or in any classroom, or language learners in the beginning English classroom. So very versatile in terms of how strategies can be employed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we've had a little trouble. Our chapter 8 authors are trying to join. So I'm just going to briefly summarize theirs in case they are able to join us and talk about it themselves. Rachel Cohen and Sarah Wyman, who are based in the States here, I believe both in New York, wrote the next chapter with a very specific analyses of 2 short stories that are commonly taught at the high school level. Ursula Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and Richard Powers' The Seventh Event. And they do a really deep dive, and I believe they also have some lesson materials on the resource tab of our book's website for how teachers can analyze these stories, one or the other, or they combine them so that students can be looking at both in terms of a short story study, and looking at the UN sustainability goals and really sort of questioning the characters and the author's craft and putting it on the reader in terms of once you find out, once you know, right, what the problem is, what the conflict is, what is your responsibility, you know, both as looking at the character lens and then yourself as the reader, what is your responsibility to take action. So it's a really informative chapter for high school level or university level students, but some of these strategies could certainly be applied to other texts for different grade levels. And our last chapter author is in Australia. She's an independent scholar from Australia, so she was not able to join because of our time zones here. But her chapter is very interesting. It explores the role of librarians, libraries, and developmental bibliotherapy in supporting climate education. Specifically, Judith offers strategies for using young adult CLI-FI to engage with students, whether they're your classroom students or your children, about the anxieties and the uncertainties they experience. And she gets into some of the research behind eco-anxiety and eco-grief and how to confront that and talk about that in a really positive way that provides young people with some agency to take action about what they're concerned about. So I hope you'll check out that chapter as well. Oh, and it looks like Judith is in our audience, so you are up late, Judith. Okay, so I'd like to open it up. We don't have a lot of time left, but I know we'll have some questions here for each other or from the audience. Ryan, the first one actually goes to you. One of our audience members is wondering the age group that you work with specifically for your inquiry project that you talked about.
Sure, yes, I should have said that. They're in grade 12, so they're seniors in high school.
But I think certainly, and I love, Ryan, you touched on this in your summary, how, you know, you're a great example of how to sort of dive into what you're interested in talking about with students, because your chapter really presents many different topics that students that age, and really, I think middle school and up, it could be adapted for what their particular interests are or concerns are in terms of that inquiry project, that they really have the opportunity to explore the thing that is their thing, right? That, you know, you provide the background and the conversations to have some of the knowledge that they need to find good resources, and then it's up to them to sort of have that exploration. So I really love that you've tapped into their interests there. And I think that's sort of some advice for any of our young teachers or more experienced teachers who are wondering how to get started, right? Start with what you love and open it up to let students explore their interests.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose what I would draw our attention to is this line from Bill McKibben when he says there's strings attached to everything. Mm-hmm. This is just true. Like, we are physical beings. We live in a physical world. I think we have a tendency to focus on our sort of cerebral consciousness as our defining element. And that might be why we so often want to separate ourselves from the world, at least cognitively, in some sort of philosophical way. We're just these fundamentally different things because of our consciousness. But that just seems wrong to me. Like, it's this illusion that we bought into and doubled down on and tripled down on. And we need to find some sort of way to kind of unpack, like, what does it mean that we think that our ability to think allows us to do whatever we like in the present, right? So some fun places to go with this is like considering, you know, Parfit's ideas about, you know, the welfare of future generations relative to the present. Not just, I shouldn't say not just, in addition to these questions of like, what do we think about our choices relative to non-human animals or to ecosystems? Do these things matter at all to us, right? Or do they matter on their own? And that's sort of again, that's the wedge that I'm starting with in this unit. And then the inquiry project goes from there.
Mhm. Yes, I love that. It really helps them to see the connections and how they can't just isolate one thing. It's broader. Great. So let's see, we have another question here. This is for any of our panelists. Do you believe that a connection with nature is important in easing climate anxiety and combating climate change? And how do you try to achieve this in your teaching? So this may be particularly important for teachers working in urban areas, if I'm understanding your question, who may not have that easy access. Okay, I see. Ryan, if you want to, yeah, sure, jump in. And anybody else, if you want to add to that after, feel free.
Me again.
Mhm.
In terms of climate anxiety, I think, and then whether or not going into the woods is useful, I think valuing the physical world by spending time in it is absolutely key in terms of developing a capacity to care about it. My view on anxiety related to the environment is to actually focus on things that we can do or that we are doing. I think going in the woods is great, but I also just love to show students like Paul Hawkins' Drawdown website, for example, which just has these 100 ranked solutions to climate change. And you just look at it, and I for me personally, it was such a pleasant surprise. I remember when I first read that book to see just how many things can be done. It was just fantastic.
Yeah, I think, Tim, are you okay with me going next? We both had our hands up. Okay. This was something that we talked about, that my co-author and I talked about, and actually used nonfiction text to supplement our YA fiction with. So in our chapter 2, I probably didn't hit it as much as I would like to, but we talk a lot about race and privilege and the interconnectedness between that and who is affected by climate change. So one of the articles that our students did read was talking about the ways in which people of color have been pushed out of like outdoor spaces, and particularly like out the culture of like being outdoors and like natural exploration, particularly in more urban areas. So being in Nashville, how have the spaces that are around us that are particularly beautiful and natural spaces, how have those been gentrified, and how have those spaces been particularly delegated only to white people in our city's context? And so we had some really interesting conversations about the fact that oftentimes communities of people of color who are disproportionately affected by the negative impact of climate change, how those people are also pushed out of enjoying the natural world, or who are made to feel discomfort in kind of hobby environmentalism as we see it now. So there were, and our students did a really, really great job of 13-year-olds doing a really great job of discussing like what it means to enjoy nature, and for who that may be safe and who is not encouraged to do that, and maybe what effect that has on the ways they see climate change playing out in their life. So that's not an answer, but they had good discussion.
I'm gonna jump, add on to that. I think, I mean, anything that we teach with students has to be infused with hope. If we lose the element of hope, then it's going to be very difficult to engage, and what's the point? I agree with Ryan about, I mean, we are, in a sense, we're organisms interacting with our environments, responding to stimuli, trying to stay alive. And if we forget that, then we've lost something, regardless of this consciousness. And for me, a lot of it is thinking that literature allows us to examine any number of ideas because authors infuse their literature with these ideas. For me, one of those ways is arts integration, right? And getting students to infuse with other arts. But for instance, the approach we took in our chapter was embodying this through performance. And how does that's a fun activity and it's a fun thing to do, but it also gets you thinking about, the more serious aspects of it. I love Maria's idea about the poem from their window. What do you see outside your window and how do you respond to that? In Chicago, we have one set of environmental problems students are dealing with pollution from large industrial outlets that are near their neighborhoods. And yet in another place, they might be dealing with the incursion of rising seawater. And, you know, these things are local and yet collectively they're global. And I think that we have to be willing to collaborate with our colleagues across disciplines. My daughter's in high school and she signed up for her junior level science class next year is going to be urban agriculture, which was not offered when I was in high school, by the way. You know, so the science curriculum is responding. We need to respond as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but it might add some information, certainly, or some perspective.
That's great. So thank you all for great responses. And we are very short on time. We've got about 4 minutes left. So I'll just sort of, some of the other questions that come in are asking about working with very young students, elementary level students. You're right that many of the chapters are focused on sort of the middle, upper level high school and beyond in terms of the works that are analyzed, but many of the strategies that the authors approach and talk about in detail would work for really any level student. It's just a matter of finding the right texts that are appropriate for the age level that you are working with. And as David David mentioned, and also in Merrick's chapter 1, Dr. Seuss is discussed in 2 of the chapters and how to use that for very young students. And fortunately now there are many young children's books that are written about the environment that really engage students about different topics that they would be interested in and care about, and that you could approach in an age appropriate way at that level. And also I appreciate the note there about using works that are written by students. A lot of the chapters do address, especially in Karna's with the poetry writing, taking projects and allowing students to sort of express themselves, and the acting with Tim's chapter in terms of getting students out there and performing for groups too, so that they are taking a role in writing their own climate story, which is really important for making that concrete connection we're talking about. I'm getting a reminder here that I'm sorry, we do, and I put a discount code for the collection in the chat, a 30% discount. I do hope audience members will check it out. And we did have a free giveaway for any of our registered participants, and the giveaway will go to, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Julie Shattuck. So Julie, if you're listening, I do have your email. Yay. And I will be in contact with you about getting that copy to you. So congrats. Oh, there she is. Okay, she's there. So I just want to, we're down to 2 minutes here, so I know we have to wrap this up. Many of us have other teaching commitments or other meetings we need to get to, as I'm sure is true for the audience. We just want to thank you very much for joining us today, and we encourage you to, join this mission, right? Like, as we're saying, we all of us are responsible for helping our students understand and confront the climate crisis. And whether we're prepared to do that or not, there are ways to start, ways to begin. And now, thankfully, it's been some years since Amitav Ghosh wrote The Great Derangement and said, where are the writers? Where are the writers on this to witness what's happening with climate change? And they have responded. There is now so many good texts represented in this book, and many that are not, obviously. So it's just a matter of tapping into what's appropriate for your students and what you're able to share with them. So thank you all. I don't know if anybody wanted to add anything. I'll be quiet here.
Rebecca, how would they access the accompanying materials like the lesson plans?
Sure. So the link to the book that I put in the chat earlier takes you to the publisher's webpage. And there are tabs on there that provide reviews, and there's a resource, I believe it's called resource tab. And a few of the chapters do have lesson plans or accompanying materials. There is, from Judith's chapter, a book review guide that details a lot of the CLI-FI that's out there and provides a nice review of that for teachers who maybe are just getting into that and looking for where to jump in. Good question. Okay, we are at 11 o'clock. So thank you so much, panelists. It has been a joy to work with all of you. And I'm so happy that we had this chance to have this conversation. And I know that our paths will continue to cross as we engage in this work together.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you
very
all.
much.
Thank you,
Goodbye for
everyone.
now.
Nice to meet you all.
Yes,
Thank
take
you.
care.